Perhaps because of a lack of autonomy in life in general, I've started practicing making AeroPress coffee. Not bad. Today I'm going to be reviewing Steppenwolf by Herman Hesse, which might be pronounced Hesse or Hesse or something more Germanic like Hesse, but I don't really know, so I'm going with Hesse. It sounds good. Steppenwolf is a 1927 novel written by Nobel Prize winner Herman Hesse. It is one of his more famous books in the English-speaking world, at least as far as I know. It gets mentioned alongside Siddhartha and The Glass Bead Game as his most popular and enduring works. I always associate Herman Hesse's work with the 60s and the counterculture because they were adopted by so many. Hey, a cat. Look at that. When I'm reading Herman Hesse, I have to constantly remind myself that no, actually this wasn't written in the 60s during the revival of the free love movement and increased drug use and rock and roll music. This was written in the 1920s where jazz was king and people were terrified of World War I, which had just happened, and had no idea that World War II was yet to come. I have to keep that in mind when I talk about this book because this book, for the average reader out there who speaks English, I'm assuming at least, is going to feel a little bit like a self-help fiction. And I know that the phrase self-help has negative connotations. Surely something that is self-help can't be good, but I want to kind of challenge that with this book. So what is Steppenwolf about? Well, it's a man who is known as the Steppenwolf by one of the characters who knows him, who introduces the book. And then we get the Steppenwolf himself as narrator who describes what's going on in his life. He's in his 50s, he's aging. We know that he was once an academic, perhaps interested in Eastern religion or comparative religion. It's not exactly 100% made clear what it is he studied, but we know what kind of person he is. He enjoys Mozart, he enjoys Goethe, he enjoys reading Novalis, the German poet. He's interested in everything high-minded, and he's a pacifist, and for all of this, he is a very miserable man. And this old man's name is Henry Haller, and we get his kind of diary entries like I mentioned, but at the same time, he is not Henry Haller. The Henry Haller is also the Steppenwolf, a wolf from the steppes. That is to say, he is also a beast, or rather, he sees himself as both this intellectual, pacifist, scholastic intellectual, and he sees himself as this kind of brute animal that is just hungry for fulfilling its desires. And he gets really fed up with this duality. He feels within himself this crazed, impossible to control self and also this high-minded self, and this leads to despair. And so over the course of his memoirs, as it were, we get his tracing of, I guess, enlightenment, if you want to call it that, but it feels more so just coming to terms with himself. He comes to terms with himself through the interaction of a girl whose name is Hermione, and because of my horrible German pronunciation and German reading skills, I was pronouncing Hermione Hermine in my head until it just clicked all of a sudden that, no, it's Hermione. And what Hermione represents is essentially this free, carefree, loving, dancing individual. There's a big focus in this novel on the old generation, Haller's generation, coming to terms with the new generation, the jazz age. And Hermione is kind of a representation of how younger generations will kind of rebel against older generations by finding new things to have fun with. In this case, it's jazz. So jazz and dancing play a big role in this novel. And it's funny looking back and seeing how at this time, jazz was seen as, something kind of scandalous, something kind of bad, something foreign even, because this takes place in a German-speaking town or city, and you can tell that there's this fear that they're being Americanized. They talk often about how they're dancing to American music, how they're adapting American values, and this seems like a negative thing. However, it's clear that Herman Hesse is criticizing those of older generations who refuse to just accept that the younger generations are going to do their own thing, whether that be through music or through new religious movements, Herman Hesse is very interested in critiquing, actually, his own generation and generations older than him, and saying, look, you need to make way for the new. Now, concerning the content of the book itself, it feels more radical when I remember that it was written in 1927. The references to drugs, the open sexuality, the open kind of despair that it brings to the table, that also relishes in Eastern mysticism and kind of a hope of annihilation into the all. All of this feels kind of cheap when we think about the commercialization of Eastern religion and mysticism in the 21st century. And so when I was reading this book, my mind kept going, this is like a self-help novel, because so often the book is kind of preachy in that it's calling your attention quite consciously to getting rid of Western ideas. One of the biggest ideas that it criticizes is the body-soul dilemma. Herman Hesse argues that there's really no such thing as a personality. You are not you, you are merely a part of the universe, and you will one day return back into the universe. And if you've read anything else by Herman Hesse, I imagine you get something similar. I haven't read too much of him, but what I've read about seems as though this is a constant theme in his work. I have read Siddhartha, which I love. I love that novel to bits. But whereas Siddhartha feels like a consciously mythological journey of enlightenment, Steppenwolf is a little more preachy. And I think this accounts for one of the reasons why it's popular. It's not very vague in what it's trying to say. What it's trying to say for 1927 is pretty radical. I think for today it might strike some people as a little on the nose. They might even see a cheapening of Eastern values in this novel. I kind of saw that. That's not to say the novel's bad though, but it's very different from other works of modernism from this period. For instance, this book is very lyrical and personal over the subjective psychological of modernisms. So whereas Stephen Dedalus in Joyce's fiction is Stephen Dedalus, and when we get his point of view, we're supposed to get his point of view, the Steppenwolf here, Harry, he is not a subjective, psychological, unique individual. He's an everyman. Likewise with Hermione. Hermione is kind of a type of person. Harry is a type of person. What we get here are lyrical explorations of general people. This isn't a good or bad thing on its own necessarily, but that is just something to keep in mind when reading Steppenwolf, that the main character is a representation of an entire class of people, the bourgeois, intellectual, middle-aged men who are thinking and feeling and responding to the new age. But I am curious to know what about this book exactly is so intriguing to people. This is what Harry himself says about the Steppenwolf. This Steppenwolf of ours has always been aware of at least the Faustian twofold nature within him. He has discovered that the one fold of the body is not inhabited by a one fold of the soul, and that at best he is only at the beginning of a long pilgrimage towards the ideal harmony. He would like either to overcome the wolf and become wholly man, or to renounce mankind and at last to live wholly a wolf's life. It may be presumed that he has never carefully watched a real wolf. Basically what goes on throughout the novel is the main character struggles between being this one self, Harry the intellectual, and Steppenwolf the beast. And the conclusion of the novel, you might not be surprised, as that passage early on in the novel indicates, is the synthesis of two different personalities. Indeed, the synthesis of all personalities. The novel ends, like I mentioned, with kind of this Eastern notion that all will return into the Brahma, to the all. And this feels fine when you're reading it, but it's almost the exact same book as Siddhartha, only I didn't find it as good. And I'm probably mispronouncing Siddhartha as well. It should probably be Siddhartha, but what can you do? Siddhartha has this really powerful movement, and you watch as someone goes through different phases of their life and they adopt orthodoxy, heterodoxy, something in between, only to eventually come back to themselves. The movement of Steppenwolf feels very much like this. I'm really happy. I'm really sad. I'm really happy. I'm really sad. Now I'm gonna be both. That's the movement of Steppenwolf. And because of that, I found it just kind of like a seesaw. I didn't find it very intriguing, very interesting, But for all that, it is a very smooth and easy read. This book uses literature and music as a way to compare generations. And Herman Hesse obviously comes away saying the new generation, you know, the kids are the future, as it were. But yeah, I don't really have that much else to say about Steppenwolf other than if you're interested in Eastern mysticism, if you're interested, I guess, in German modernism, give this one a go. But if you're not interested in books that are preachy or clearly have a message for you to take home with you, you might want to skip this one. So while I wouldn't say run out and go grab this book to read, if you see it, might as well pick it up. It's pretty short. And also, because it did have such a huge impact in the United States and England during the counterculture of the 60s, it's worth seeing that. I think it's really cool that Herman Hesse does create an image of the counterculture as we think of it in the 60s long before. Anyway, hope you check it out, or if you don't, that you read something else by him that you enjoy. I'm probably going to try out The Glass Bead Game, his other popular novel, and we'll see how that goes. But yeah, I just figured I'd make this short review, and let me know what you think of Steppenwolf if you've read it. Anyway, take it easy, have a good one.